difference between a lager and an ale, Taplines listener? I'm guessing you probably do, given you're listening to a podcast about modern beer history, but just in case you're a little foggy, the basic distinction between these two taxonomical pillars is the strain of yeast that each is fermented with and how it operates and how it likes to be treated. Without varying technicalities, ales are brewed with a top fermenting yeast that prefers warmer temperatures, while lagers are brewed with a bottom fermenting yeast that prefers, you guessed it, colder temperatures. These load-bearing branches of beer's family tree have each spawned countless styles, and they rarely intersect themselves, but sometimes they do. Today's episode is about, you guessed it again, one of those times. In 2018, Cold Beer's Kevin Davey was working as the brewmaster of Portland, Oregon's Wayfinder beer when he hit upon the idea of brewing an India Pale Ale with lager yeast. Hazy IPAs had yet to consolidate their grasp as the dominant substyle of the traditional West Coast variety, and this was the age of tinkering. In fact, Davey says his experimental brew was an answer of sorts to Kim Sturdivant's Brut IPA invention in San Francisco during that same era. Go back and check out that episode with Sturdivant directly prior to this one for the Brut IPA story if you're interested, listener. At Wayfinder, Davey called his crisp, clear, dry-hopped creation Cold IPA, a nod to its lager-like production process, and, of course, the temperature that it was meant to be drank at. Despite its tongue-in-cheek name, it's no gimmick, and it's stuck around long enough to leave a small but growing legacy as an IPA for lager lovers and more. Today we're going to talk about it. It's Kevin Davey, it's the Cold IPA, it's how this quirky crossover substyle got hot, and it's all right here, right now, on Fine Pair's Taplines. We got a very special treat today, Taplines listeners. We're joined by a man who's been called the Pied Piper of Cold IPA. I'm talking, of course, about Kevin Davey. Kevin, welcome to Taplines, man.
Thanks, Dave. Well, thanks for being here. Or thanks for having me, of course. I'm sorry.
I'm not here. I'm there. Kevin, where are you? Where are you joining us from?
We're in beautiful McMinnville, Oregon, where it's raining and about 45 degrees outside.
Nice. Pacific Northwest, get at me. Kevin, we're glad to have you on the show. You are the Director of Operations at Heater Allen Gold Dot, a relatively new entrant to the wild world of craft beer. We're here today to talk about your career and specifically a pretty, I would say, industry famous, if not full bore famous. Part of it was a moment towards the end of last decade when everyone was sort of casting around, trying to figure out what was going to come next after the West Coast IPA, the Hazy IPA, Brut IPA, excuse me. Everyone was wondering, and you had an answer for that, Kevin. What was the answer?
Well, it's kind of funny because I think that looking back on it now, I think that a lot of people were doing what I was doing anyway. And so maybe there was a certain amount of polygenesis, what we were trying to do is this thing called Cold IPA. And it kind of started off as a joke. We made this beer that was going to be the antithesis of Hazy IPA, mainly because here I was at a brewery called Wayfinder, where I was the founding brewmaster. And we were a lager-centric brewery that made a lot of IPA. And we're in Portland, and Hazy had kind of came to the West Coast, I think, later than everybody else.
Yep.
It was very much on an East Coast thing. And by the time it came out here, there's a lot of older brewers and we're pretty grumpy. We've been doing it for a long time. we like to say that, craft beer started in Northern California and Portland and Oregon and Washington. So I think that, with that little chip on our shoulder, we're like, well, what else can we do? And, so my thought was, well, I want to take all the things that Hazy IPA is and kind of make the opposite. Mm-hmm. And that was kind of what we ended up trying to do is Cold IPA. Now, I think it's kind of interesting because if you look at West Coast IPA now, I can say this pretty comfortably because I just judged the Oregon Beer Awards, and I'm on a medal round of IPA. So this is all the IPAs in Oregon that have entered. And on the medal round, every single one of those glasses looks like a Cold IPA. They're all brilliant. They're all yellow. They have different spectrums of hops, but they're all very dry. So I don't know if I really created something totally different, but I definitely came up with an idea that I think got really, really popular. And I think that the marketing itself was really helpful too for people, just for customers to understand where we were going with West Coast.
Yeah, it was the right idea at the right time to some extent. I mean, we spoke with Kim Sturdivant, who came up with Brut IPA right around that era as well, and that was an interesting idea, but ultimately not the right idea necessarily for that moment. It had some uptake, but ultimately not too much, and it fizzled out. Cold IPA is a little different. Still, I would say, I don't know. How do you perceive it in the marketplace, Kevin? Obviously, you're surrounded by it because you are or at least a early progenitor of it. But what's your perception? I kind of think of it as, it's still a niche. It's not its own category still, right? Like it doesn't have its own category officially as a style. What's your perception about where it sits in the marketplace?
It's kind of interesting because I think that it's everybody's third IPA. Like if you're
right.
If you're a cool tap house, you're going to have a West Coast, you're going to have a standard American IPA, you're going to have a hazy, and then it can be solidly a third choice. But it's nobody's first choice other than our bar, which I think is kind of funny. I think it's kind of moving that way. I think calling it Cold IPA makes it a third, but if I weren't to call it cold, I just called it West Coast. I think it could jump into the number one slot really quickly. What's kind of funny about Cold IPA is that, we started this in 2018, and it's still got some staying power. There's people still brewing them. I'm hearing about this worldwide. My friend was just in Prague, and he found Cold IPAs in Prague. So that was weird. It was kind of cool for me, but
very. I've got a question for you, if you don't mind. Let me jump in here. The promise for Taplines listeners when we started this podcast over a year ago, we're on episode 60-ish. I don't know. By the time this comes out, gosh, maybe even more than 60. But we've been doing this for a while, and the promise from the very beginning is it wouldn't just be two white guys talking about IPA. So we're going to talk about IPA, but we're going to do what we do here on Taplines, which is go back to the moment, go back to sort of the scene. You touched on it a little bit before. You were at Wayfinder when Cold IPA sort of first, crossed the transom for you, or it really first became real for you. I'm wondering if you said 2018 or so. Take us back to what the scene looked like in Oregon a little bit. You touched on the fact that hazy had kind of arrived, and a bunch of brewers who maybe weren't so impressed with it in the way the American drinking public has been so impressed with it, were a little frustrated by it or a little grumpy about it. Take us back. Tell me the vibe. What were people drinking? What was on your radar at that time? Set the scene a little bit.
It's funny because for me, hazy IPA, I think the top 5%, the cream of the crop hazy IPAs are wonderful.
Yeah.
And I find them really delicious. And then there's the bottom 95 where I just
a fucking
I don't like them at all.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Right.
And I feel like I can get through a West Coast IPA that I'm not really into fine. I think that the problem is that guests, beer enthusiasts just have been going toward this sweeter, fruit flavored, or just beer flavored beers. It's been a huge part of what we are making these days. And Cold IPA was the opposite. I'm like, well, this is a beer drinker's IPA. This is a very dry and very bitter beer. This isn't a gateway beer at all. This is for people who really, really are already in it pretty hard.
Right.
And so I'm not a big fan of the hazy, on the West Coast here, and especially in Seattle. There's Seattle and Washington State. There's a lot of hazy IPA brewers that are making them really dry, and brewing them very different than I think that the way that the more East Coast and especially the Midwest, where they've been back sweetened and are very they're very soft and very fruit forward. I think like Cloudburst and Varietal and Holy Mountain and a few of those guys have just been making these beers that are a lot more assertive and a lot more cool. So it's kind of fun to see that beer change. So, because back in 2018 when we were doing this, so we launched Wayfinder in 2017. We were brewing our first beers in 2017, and then 2018 is pretty much when I'm rounding out the beer list and seeing which ones stick and which ones don't. And we had Flower in the Kettle, which was our hazy, and it was kind of a joke name because I was at GABF judging, and we were on the IPA round, and we had heard about hazies a couple of years. This was a couple of years before 2017. And I'm like, hey, did you hear that a lot of brewers are adding flour in the kettle to to get the haze? You think we'll get any of these beers? Because I didn't know what the hell they were doing. And so I'm like, well, flour in the kettle sounds cool. Kind of sounds like fire in the hole. So I made this hazy IPA called Flour in the Kettle. And then we had Doomtown, which is our West Coast, named after the Wiper song about Portland. And so I was trying to come up with a third one, and I wanted to make one that was even cleaner and more dry. And the other thing is we were a lager brewery. So we're already bringing in a dry yeast for hazy, and that was a complete pain in the butt. Or we were borrowing it from Great Notion, which was fine. It's not a big deal. It's funny because this might not be as popular out on the East Coast, but in Portland, there's so many breweries just down the street from each other that we all just kind of share yeast.
Yeah.
It's like this weird, we're all like lovers. It's kind of cool.
It's exactly like Lovers. It's also that sexy, listener. Yeah. It's
Here, brew with my yeast.
Someone from the health department is like, what the fuck?
What the fuck is going on? As long as it's not the TTB, we're okay.
That's right. Okay, so you got yeast from Great Notion for one of your hazies?
Yeah, well, I mean, we were borrowing yeast from Great because they were making enough of it that they always had plenty. And so I think I wasn't the only one. I think everybody was swapping by with empty kegs, being like, hey, can I have some of that free juicy yeast? Mm-hmm. And so, I wanted to make an IPA that was made with a lager yeast because I had a lot of lager yeast laying around, and we're dumping that down the drain. So, we're putting it onto our spent grain and sending it to cattle. It was not going down the drain.
Nice.
Good save.
It's excellent save, yeah. Actually, you'll be citizens arrested momentarily. I have a team out there, yeah.
We pushed around the idea of making something like IPL, and I've had a bunch of IPLs, and I wasn't a huge fan of them. I still haven't had one that I really am in love with. To me, IPL, or India Pale Lager, is brewed with lager yeast, but fermented cold. It is usually made with an all malt base, usually some Munich and Vienna in there, something to increase the body. It's the gravity is a bit low, so it's 6.5% or lower alcohol by volume was pretty standard on those beers, and then dry hop because they're fermented cold. You're not really bringing them up that warm. You're dry hopping them pretty cold too, and then lagering them to a certain degree. These always came across as kind of a more like Imperial Pilsner, where you had some noble hops in there, and you had some grassiness, and I just wanted to have something that was more brash, something more punk rock, something more in your face and bitter and very dry. And so we looked at using adjunct, and we were a decoction brewery. We had a decoction vessel specifically made because we make Czech, Wayfinder. We made Czech Pilsner. We made a Doppelbock with a local band called Yob that was quad decocted. We used our decoction vessel all the time for decocted lagers. And so I was like, well, what else can we use this thing for? And my thought was, well, let's do a cereal mash and brew like Anheuser-Busch and Coors and those guys do. And so I started calling around to people that I knew in the industry that worked at some of the bigger breweries. I'm like, well, how do you process, what's your procedure for processing these raw grains? And there are a lot of people who are just like, well, we're on syrups now. We don't even use our cereal mashes anymore. We're just using a syrup. And I'm like, well, that's lame. I can't say that's everybody that I was talking to, but so then I started talking around to a friend named Greg Casey, and he worked at Pabst and Stroh's, and he's been working in the industry for a very long time. He's retired. He's writing a book on American craft or American brewing, American lager brewing. And I asked him about where to source, raw rice and how it should be milled and how to mash it, and he was a great resource for that. So we ended up using, a pretty high mash bill of raw rice, and then ended up being raw corn when rice skyrocketed one year. Um, so we're just using this a raw product, boiling it, sending it through a gelatinization rest, and then mashing it on top of American barley, and using the enzymes in the American barley to convert the raw rice or corn. And that made the beer lighter, but it also adds a certain amount of mouthfeel, and I think that it adds a certain amount of aroma and flavor, probably more in light lager than it does in something like Cold IPA. But it adds something that syrups don't. When you process a cereal grain like that down to a syrup, it just becomes kind of lifeless. So when you're actually using the raw product milled into a fine meal, is really what we're using. You're still retaining, it's beta glucan. There is protein, there is beta glucan, there's starch. There's a lot of other flavors involved with rice and corn that aren't just sugar. The Brewers Association and a lot of us brewers have been kind of bad-mouthing adjunct brewing for years and years and years because, the verbiage has always been, oh, well, those big breweries use that to lighten the flavor and it's just to make it cheaper. And we craft brewers, we're using all malt beer and it's more full flavored and you should buy our stuff. And I think that thing is changing. I think that idea is changing. Because they are now allowing breweries like Yingling and August Shell, who have been heritage American breweries that have been making these adjunct beers for a very long time,
200
centuries.
years, 150 years or so, yeah.
Yeah. And they've been making these beers for a long time, and the Brewers Association finally said, well, actually, they're craft brewers too, because they're not part of the big three, or now the big two, I guess.
Right. And outside the U.S., the big 1.5 or so.
Right.
Yeah, right.
1.5 that isn't Diageo and Heineken.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Right. Okay. Yeah. But you feel like the situation is changing, or the winds are sort of blowing in a different direction within the BA defined craft sort of ecosphere or whatever, sphere of influence, whatever you want to call it. Was that the case when you were working on developing the first cold IPA that you worked on at Wayfinder back in 2018 or so? What was the vibe like vis-a-vis adjuncts, vis-a-vis some of these more boundary pushing recipes that maybe looked a little bit or did some of the same things as some of those bigger macro brewers? Not that Anheuser-Busch is out there brewing cold IPA, but rice is it appears right on, at least probably at that point, maybe since, appeared right on the side of Bud Light's packaging, right? That was a key ingredient that they advertised. The American.
I'm in no way insinuating that Anheuser-Busch does not use raw rice and that they use syrup. There's other breweries that I'm saying about that. Anheuser-Busch, I still believe, uses rice, pure rice.
Yeah. Oh, I believe that was fair enough. That wasn't even the point I was trying to make. I was curious about sort of what the milieu was like within the industry about using this type of ingredient and working with this type of ingredient in the way that you were when you were working on the cold IPA back in 2018.
Well, I mean, you could go back to actually just brewhouse design a lot and brewery knowledge. I think that a lot of craft beer, I could say pretty confidently that most craft brewers in the U.S. started as home brewing, as home brewers, myself included.
Mr. Beer.
Right. And a lot of what was, Prohibition destroyed a lot of heritage of how to make beer. We didn't really know how to do it on a small scale. All the Americans that knew how to make beer were just very large brewers. And so a lot of the small craft of making beer, was lost. And you see this, if you go to Czech Republic, having a 2-vessel system that is capable of decoction is standard. In America, it's not standard, and they wouldn't think of having a mixer or going through mash steps. Over here, it's because of home brewing and because of maybe British texts about brewing. Single infusion mashing is key. It's everywhere. It's I would say the vast majority of how beer is brewed in America. It's not decoction brewing, and it is not lager. Most lager brewers have mash kettles, have a way of step mashing. And some of them have mash kettles and decoction kettles like August Shell and Ealing and those guys. And then smaller brewers like Wayfinder. And so it's interesting because to be able to use those, the ironic thing is to be able to use those whole ingredients, which are very American. Using corn in a beer is a very American thing to do.
Right.
And by America, I mean North America,
Sure.
And corn and rice were used in Europe. They were used in Germany. Believe it or not, Reinheitsgebot is kind of a fairy tale that there is, and this is coming out in Greg Casey's book, that brewers in Europe were using corn and rice before the war a lot.
Really?
Yes.
Blowing the fucking kettle lid right off the German purity law. We look forward to Greg Casey's book, man.
Yeah, you should.
I actually didn't know that.
Yeah, it's I think it's after the war. Is to understand a bit of this is also to understand a bit of history. After the war, as any culture would, they wanted to hold on to the good things about their heritage, and making really great lager beer is a really good thing about German heritage. Mm-hmm. And so the Reinheitsgebot made a lot of sense to say, hey, this is what we do. This is what we should be proud of. This is what this is who we are. And so things that probably don't fit that are a little inconvenient. But that's kind of history all over the world,
Yeah.
We all tell ourselves a story about who we are and what we are because of what we want to be. And I think that that's true with the Brewers Association and them saying corn and rice is used to lighten the body and it won't add any flavor, which I think is false. And then also that it would make the beer cheaper, which on the corn side probably is true, but because it's subsidized in America.
Right.
But rice is incredibly expensive. Rice is far more expensive than barley, 2, 3 times, 4 times as expensive sometimes, because it's a worldwide product. It's a table product. It's not like you go buy 50-pound bags of barley and come home and be like, hey guys, let's have barley for dinner again. It's not something that we eat, but rice is something that humans eat a lot of. And so the price of rice fluctuates a lot because of that.
Mm.
So I think it's kind of ironic. I think it's really good for us to be using whole grains and trying to get something that is more, trying to do something that is more standard. I can't even say scientifically. I mean, if you want to say scientifically, does it matter whether it's a syrup or not? Probably you can make some arguments that it doesn't matter, but I would say that it does. Mm-hmm. I think that you can taste the difference. I think that there are physically things that are going into that liquid that are not always as measurable as we might think that they have. And they might not be able to fly through a taste panel of the average American, be able to tell the difference, but I think it does matter.
Okay, was that the project when you first started working on this? Like, was this something that you came to after having sort of developed and tweaked the recipe to get to the final product? Like, you feel strongly about this. Has that always been the case?
Well, I think that I feel like when I entered the beer scene in 2009, there was definitely there was what I felt was kind of a split between lager brewers and ale brewers in our nation. I think that, and not like a negative, not like, oh, you guys suck. No, you guys suck.
God, like the dorkiest rendition of West Side Story ever.
That would be incredibly dorky. I think that the biggest difference was mainly that in the way that we thought about how beer was made. And this was totally made clear to me when I started working for Gordon Biersch. And Gordon Biersch is a lager brewery started by Dan Gordon. And it was acquired by a brew pub group that owned Rock Bottom. And Rock Bottom's a great brewery group that started in, I think, Boulder, Colorado, or either Boulder or Denver. And the two companies could not be more different when it came to how to make beer.
Right.
And, the Gordon Biersch guys were like, okay, we're not going to do it that way, or we don't want to use that company, or we don't want to use those ingredients, and the Rock Bottom guys would feel the same way about the Gordon Biersch fellas and ladies and everything like that. It's, I felt like there was just this, and some of this stuff is incredibly dorky. It's like, well, how do you aerate wort? Well, the lager people do this and the ale people do that. And how do you mash barley? Well, the ale people do this and the lager people do that. And how do you, what's standard for spunding a tank? How do you carbonate? How do you do, is filtration normal or is it not normal? You know, and, so.
But this is tradecraft, and the tradecraft varies depending on which yeast you're using and which side of the lager ale divide you're working on predominantly.
Right. And I feel like a lot of the big names in beer, and this might not be as true on the East Coast because there's so much large lager brewing with Sam Adams and I mean, everybody else out there that I probably can't even think off the top of my head because I'm just not East Coast enough. But I feel like a lot of the craft brewers in my neck of the woods and that I would run into had kind of this almost ale bias where it's just like, well, this is standard in beer making.
Right.
And this was even true at the Master Brewers Association meetings I'd go to, where people would talk about beer making like, well, this is how beer's made. And then some of us lager brewers were in the back scratching our heads like, is it though? You know, like
right.
And so there was a little bit of difference, and so I felt like this probably is just a little chip on my shoulder as I was like all of this anti-adjunct rhetoric. I always felt a little like, well, is that just anti-adjunct or is it anti-lager? You know, because the big corporate breweries were lager brewers. And it even seems now to this day, like as much as us Brewers Association people don't like Anheuser-Busch, or ABI, the global
behemoth.
They are
it's just a bunch of
a brewery.
Yeah, right. I was going to make a dumb joke about how Anheuser-Busch InBev is Maureen Ogle, the historian who wrote Ambitious Brew. Mm-hmm. Listeners know her from a couple, actually, I think she's been on 3 times. She hammers the point that it is not the same company, but for part of the name. I mean, Anheuser-Busch is dead and gone, and Anheuser-Busch InBev, which has taken its place, is, I think she's referred to it, or I've certainly heard others refer to it as, it's like an investment banking portfolio that happens to operate breweries, right? Like this is a totally different sort of perspective on how to address the beer drinking market, not just in the United States, but worldwide. Your point is well made. These are not the same companies, but you were talking about Anheuser-Busch.
Well, I'm sorry. The interesting thing about that is that even with that, I think it's kind of funny that they conveniently say Anheuser-Busch. It's still Anheuser-Busch when they talk about brewing here in the States.
Right.
But it's not. Anheuser-Busch is gone.
Right.
And just like you say, but the interesting thing about that is from the brewing side of it, not so much the marketing side and who makes the beers and where do they go and what do the customers feel, but from the brewing side of it, Anheuser ABI is still a brewing company. They still own a lot of breweries. Sure. They own mainly breweries. But we have a lot of, in the craft brewing industry now, we have a lot of people in our industry that are not brewers, that have never really cared about brewery. We have breweries that are now just cannabis companies that buy breweries as part of their portfolio, and they have absolutely zero idea of how breweries should or could or can operate, or what the industry standard would be to spend money on this versus that, you know. And so it's interesting because since everything's changing quite a lot, you know. I think it's time.
No,
Go ahead.
I do agree. The point, I feel like the salient point here is, or that I was trying to make, I could be off base here, maybe I got myself tripped up, is that Anheuser-Busch InBev's corporate executives these days, and for a while, I mean, they're not brewers by trade, right? Like famously, the Busch family, you know, they weren't necessarily working the brew house except for photo ops, but they came from a brewing family, right? The Miller family came from a brewing family. We had an episode about the Schlitz family, which had gotten out of the Schlitz brewery. The Eline family was mostly not brewers by the time Schlitz imploded in mid 60s, started to implode in the mid 60s or so. The point I was trying to make is that when non-brewers come to positions of power in brewing corporations, big brewing corporations where, marketing and market position and investment in other breweries matters maybe more than the recipes and the trade craft, which has already been sort of nailed down, right? The product has already been established. You maybe get some, I don't know if I make a moral judgment. You get a different result than if you have brewers in charge of the businesses. Again, I don't know that there's a moral judgment to be made there, but like it changes the nature of the corporation, I think.
Well, maybe we should go back to the term microbrewery instead of craft brewery.
Yeah,
I mean,
God,
honestly,
who knows, man?
Because we talk about that, and it's an easy thing to say, and it's totally convenient and true that ABI and these bigger companies are run by admin and women, and the sale, like the beer just didn't matter really, and it got dumber and dumber and dumber, and it was all based on focus groups and what does the average person want to drink. And that sucks for beer, but at least as a company and how it did operate as a brewery. And now you've got on the craft side, companies being bought by spirits and by cannabis and by investment banks and all these other things. And
private equity.
All of a sudden,
no doubt.
All the animals on Animal Farm are looking at the pigs, and why are the pigs sleeping in the house again? Why are the pigs standing on two legs? You know. I'm just like, are they still craft? You know, because just because the Brewers Association is taking their money doesn't really make them craft. They're not making beer for 80% of their product. They're making seltzer and they're making cider.
Amen to that. I know a lot of Taplines listeners will be cheering as they listen to this podcast. I know you may not want to put names to it, but listeners, for those of you who don't follow the industry quite as closely, some examples maybe of what Kevin is talking about that I'll put out there for you guys just for posterity. Monster Energy Drink, the corporation, I think it's called Monster Beverage Corporation technically, obviously acquired Canarchy, the craft collective that was a roll-up. It was a private equity roll-up actually of Oscar Blues and Cigar City, Wasatch, a bunch of others. They acquired them in 2020, early 2022, I want to say. And then even more recently, Tilray Brands, which had already made, and they're a big Canadian cannabis corporation, predominantly. That's their business, is cannabis. I want to say August 2023, Tilray scooped up not one, not two, but 7 craft brewing brands here in the United States from Anheuser-Busch InBev, who was doing a fire sale to downsize its portfolio in the craft space. Tilray had already acquired Sweetwater and Montauk and Green Flash, Alpine at that point. And all of a sudden, with the stroke of a pen, it went from kind of an interesting side player in the space to the 5th largest BA-defined craft brewer in the country this year. Landscape is changing, as Kevin has described, and there are very real examples of instances where either, firms with financial background, a private equity player, or firms that have very little background in beer, no background in beer, like an energy drink corporation or a cannabis company, are coming in and playing in a similar lane or with a similar look and feel to what folks I think would traditionally have thought of as microbrewing. Kevin, thank you for indulging that long detour, but just for the clarity or for the benefit of our listeners who maybe aren't quite as tuned in to the beer business as the rest of us, I figured it was worth hashing out.
Well, one of the things I just wanted to bring up to close that thought is to support small local brewery-owned breweries, because we're trying to do something. We're trying to make a product that's really, really excellent, that beer lovers will like, whether they're craft beer lovers or they're large beer lovers. It doesn't matter. If you love beer, I think that you would love Heater Allen Brewery and Gold Dot. I think that our beers are set up for that. And if we don't, I'm not saying, oh, support us or we're going to cry about it. I'm not trying to say that. I'm trying to say that spend your money where you want, don't look at it as a commodity. Look at it as something that is important to you,
The tension, totally. The tension between commodity and, artisanal product, right, is at the core of a lot of what this industry has gone through, what the coffee industry has gone through. We see that play out, and, the gravity for commodity is really powerful, and fighting against that, to your point, requires, customer buy-in.
Yeah. And so I guess that all comes back to Cold IPA. Here we go. So
bring it back.
Bringing it all back. So So originally I was using this decoction vessel to make an American lager. I wanted to do that. I wanted to make something that was effectively a raw ingredient, no syrup, no flaked product. Brew it like an American brewery did in the 60s or in the 40s or in the 20s. How can I make a beer that is made with primarily American ingredients and make a really, really, really good version of it? And so we made this beer called Wayfinder Dry, and it was a 30% rice product. It was like 10.5 Play-Doh, so that ended up being about 4 point. It was very dry beer, so it was 4.5, 4.6% alcohol. Incredibly drinkable, incredibly light. I was really proud of being able to accomplish that, and it took calling around to a lot of people in the industry. And it's funny because some of the old codgers in the industry are like, "Why do you want to make that?" And me, I'm just, and for me, I'm just like, because I don't know. I've always aspired. I remember when I was a home brewer, it was just like, well, you can shit on Pabst all you want, but you can't brew that. Yeah, good luck.
Right.
And maybe it was just I had a chip on my shoulder thinking that I couldn't do it, and I wanted to prove that I could. So we did it. It was successful. During COVID, we ended up rebranding it, putting it in 6-packs and calling it number 6, because we were kind of a vaguely sinister brewery. And so when you held up the 6-pack, it said 666.
666. Cool. Yeah, there you go.
But I love this beer. You could stick it in a cooler full of ice, and it was pretty much the what if American light lager was absolutely delicious, and that was really what I wanted to accomplish. And so doing that, that's when I got kind of well, what if we take that whole grain bill and we don't have it as light, we keep it stronger, keep it at like 15 Play-Doh. And then from there on out, we treat it like an IPA. Mm-hmm. We bitter it a lot, aggressively bitter it with, bitter extracts, and then also a lot of late hopping. We ferment it warm with a lager yeast, which will go clean. And then we do early hops, so fermentation hops, dry hop, and then also late dry hopping, and we spund it. What if we do all these different things?
Right.
And keep it super yellow. We were filtering it at the original batches. We were filtering because I wanted it to look absolutely strikingly clear. We're able to just get away with just findings these days, but that was the birth of Cold IPA. And the name Cold was really kind of like a joke, kind of like cold filtered, bold, flavored like the Rockies. I thought that stuff is absolutely hilarious and old
Right.
now. It's antiquated. Like, people don't do that anymore, but I think it's funny, and I wanted to bring it back. Well, what if IPA was cold and bold and filtered like the Rockies? And that's what it is.
How did people take to it at first? Do you remember what the reaction was at Wayfinder from the customers?
I think people were originally like, what makes it cold? Isn't all beer cold? And me being like, yeah, it's a joke. Get it?
No, you're supposed to laugh.
You're supposed to laugh.
We're having fun at work. Please buy my Cold IPA.
But, there was people that didn't get it, but then there was people that got it. They're just like, oh, Cold IPA. And then they got it like, oh, okay, yeah, it's cold. Yeah, it's cold. That's fun. It's like, it is a fun beer. And after people drink it, I think that people are like, wow, it's like really sneaky and strong and very hoppy, and it's my mom likes it, so that's important to me.
It's the most important metric, I would say. Yeah.
You got to have your mom like it. She doesn't like IPAs, so
even better.
What
a ringing endorsement! Yeah.
If anybody's out there listening, Brenda, loves Cold IPA. She loves my Cold IPA.
You're right.
Kathy,
no one
it's
else.
My favorite.
You do a great Brenda. I've never met her, but I can just tell that's dead on. Yeah. Okay,
yeah,
so mom likes it. Customers seem to like it. Does it sell well? Do you remember like the performance from a sales standpoint?
I think from a sales standpoint, it was always like I said, the third IPA. It was
Right.
never really like that big. It took a while to take off, but I remember there was this moment where there was a couple brewers hanging out and they were drinking Cold IPA. And I'm like, hey, what are you drinking? They're like, oh, we're having the Relapse, which is Cold IPA. And I'm like, you guys like my IPA, the Cold IPA? And they're like, yeah, this thing is pretty good, dude. And I was like, oh, okay, well, okay. People are getting it. And then after that, because brewers are the early adopters when it comes to new beer style.
Sure.
If they think it's cool, then it becomes cool. And I think that there's plenty of brewers that jumped on the train just because they thought, oh, well, people will buy it if it's called cold. And that's a dumb way to do anything, really. But if you actually try to make it, the way that I was making it, where it's dry and hoppy and clean, I think that customers totally get it. That being said, so there was also at the same time a lot of right now in California, a lot of brewers are using 3470 lager yeast for their IPAs and just calling them IPA, and they're not calling them Cold IPA. And they never really did. So this is kind of like the new thing. The Brewers Association has since they have American IPA as one of the categories you can enter, but then they have another one called West Coast India Pale, and that's what it said when I was at the World Beer Cup this year. They just dropped the word ale. It's still in the ale category, but it doesn't say ale anymore. And I'm like, well, that's kind of dumb. My push for it was always like, well, put it in the hybrid side. It could be made with lager yeast. It could be made with, it's lager fermented warm. So it's not fermented like a lager. It's fermented much like a steam beer. And we have steam beers in the hybrid side. So I can see Cold IPA being in the hybrid side too. What is interesting about Cold IPA is that, this goes, the naming, I think that most people that have the problem with it are like, well, you can't call it Cold IPA because A in IPA stands for ale and it's not an ale. I'm like, well, sure. Well, what about black IPA? And they'd probably make the same argument. Well, India Black Ale. It can't be a ale if it's black. Right. And I just think that that's stupid because the term IPA means hop. You know what? IPA is a marketing term at this point. It doesn't mean it went to India. It doesn't mean it resembles English beer that went to India. It doesn't resemble it at all. It is its own style. It's its own thing. It's a very hoppy American beer.
You're going to have like 3 insufferable nerds in your email inbox after this episode comes out yelling at you for this semantic footwork that you're doing right now. But I agree with you. I tend to agree that, everyone understands. Everyone who's approaching this in good faith either is learning it for the first time and capable of making a distinction or already understands the stakes. And if they're normal, they don't really give a shit. So point taken. Right. Point taken.
Yeah. I know I keep on trying to defend it, and maybe I shouldn't be defending it because it just makes, I'm just giving breath to something that doesn't need to be defended. It's fine.
Taplines is a place to air your grievances. We're glad to take and foster and ideally stoke industry-wide beefs here on our podcast. So if there's anyone you want to call out by name, we're ready. No, I'm kidding. But okay, so people like it. Brewers start picking up on it. I'm curious, Kevin. Like I said, we also did an episode not too long ago with Kim Sturdivant, who is credited with coming up with Brut IPA. These were somewhat contemporary sort of developments in the craft beer scene and in specifically on the West Coast scene. Kim was working down in the Bay Area at the time when he put the first Brut IPA on, or what would come to be known as Brut IPA on. I've read in researching for this podcast, I read somewhere along the way that you view Cold IPA as sort of like a counterpoint to Brut IPA. I was wondering if, for the benefit of the listeners, we're deep into IPA substyles here. Anyone who's made it this far in the podcast obviously wants to geek out on this shit. Anyone who doesn't probably bailed 20 minutes ago, but that's okay. We're having fun here. I'm curious how you saw those two styles Cold IPA and Brut IPA interact in the marketplace back then? I mean, were you seeing customers pick up one or not the other? Were you seeing education going on for Brut that wasn't really sort of sticking in the drinker's mind? Like, talk to us a little bit about the dynamic there.
Well, there's a few things. One, I'm a friend of Kim's, and I talked to Kim during this whole time too. I am never made a Brut IPA, but I remember when they were being made, and it popped and fizzed out really quick, which is kind of a bummer because I think that the beers themselves were really good. I think some of them were really good. The problem I found was that there wasn't enough information out there about how to do it, and there was a lot of misinformation. And so I talked to Kim a little bit about this. He started like a web page about Brut IPA.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I don't know if it went far enough because for me, I made this beer called Relapse Cold IPA. It was kind of a joke. And then all of a sudden I get an email from Poland. I get an email from somebody in Florida. I get an email from somebody in, Chicago. Somebody else calls. They're like, well, how do you make this cold IPA thing? I want to know more about this. And I'm like, crap, it's a thing. So that's when I called Kim up and I'm like, well, when did I wasn't trying to make this a thing,
Now what do I do?
Well, because then I started seeing the writing on the wall and it was like, well, it could pop and fizzle out like Brut because I feel like a lot of people made Brut poorly and not the way that Kim would have brewed it. And so there was a lot of bad examples out there and then it got a bad taste in people's mouths. And people were like, I don't like Brut IPA. I don't want to brew that. I don't want to buy that. I don't want that. And I didn't want it to do that way because I didn't want to be thought of as like the beer that, Cold IPA is just a big stupid joke and it sucks. I'm like, well, I think it has some legs and I think it can move. So, that's when, it helped that when it was really taking off was during the pandemic. And so there's a lot of people sitting around in front of computers talking about it. And so I just said yes to everybody who wanted to have me on a podcast or write an article about it. I made a side of our webpage at Wayfinder was dedicated to it. I sent a description of how to brew it or the style guidelines to the Brew Association. I kind of just cut and paste a lot of their style guidelines together from like malt liquor and West Coast IPA, or rather American IPA and I think steam beer, like just stuck all those things together. Like, here it is. And I think that really helped people get it. I think that, even with that, there's still a lot of bad cold IPAs out there. It's not like you're going to order one and it's always going to be a life-changing moment. But, I think that because of that, you're allowed, it's been more, it has more legs. It's been able to move. It's been able to be a cool beer because of that.
Yep. I mean, even something as simple as people immediately understand how to say it out loud helps a little bit, right? Like Brut is not in the American lexicon especially for casual drinkers who are not as familiar with it. You see that on a menu, you're nervous. You maybe just don't order that beer. It sounds stupid, but like that's part of customer behavior, right? Like I could see myself struggling with that. So yeah, I mean, your point about, trying to sort of shepherd this style forward is well made. And what I wanted to get to in this interview, so I'm glad that we did, is this idea that like this stuff, somewhat it happens, right? But like everyone kind of looks back at like the rise of IPA as though West Coast IPA as though it was inevitable, right? And maybe it was to some extent, right? Like the, American tastes were changing, but people thought the same thing about brown ales back when, Pete's Wicked was on the scene and that also seemed inevitable, right? And it's not, is the point, is that there's a lot of work that goes on both at the brew house, as you've described over the course of this episode with, developing cold IPA, but then also the education component, yes, to the customer, but also to the industry to make sure that people understand what this thing is and why it works and what is definitive about it. And if you don't do that, or even if you do it, but it doesn't stick in the right way or it doesn't reach the right people, it can go off the rails pretty quick. And then, as you say, a drinker picks up a cold IPA, has a bad one, and then decides I'll never drink this again because why would I? I don't like it, And yeah, no, it's a great point.
So Brut IPA, so Cold IPA was really kind of like what you were saying originally, which was it Cold IPA kind of based on this? It was me saying, okay, I want to make up this different thing, but I'm going to take elements of Brut IPA, elements of West Coast IPA, and elements of IPL and stick them all together. And so I was influenced by Brut IPA. I think that there was so much potential there that didn't get used, which was a bummer.
Yeah.
Because an incredibly dry, sparkling yellow IPA is really cool. And Brut is, I guess, I thought it was actually a pretty cool marketing term. I mean, it's based on wine, right? It's based on champagne. I don't know. I think the other thought about Cold IPA was, I think that sometimes when it came to Brut IPA, they were using the cereal grains as like a flavor. Like, let's use like actual Kellogg's Corn Flakes, or something like that. And to get that corny flavor. And for me, I'm like, well, how would a lager brewer approach Brut IPA? And this is kind of what I was coming at. It was also looking at like Pliny the Elder and Russian River beers.
Sure.
And Firestone Walker, where I worked. And I remember early in my home brewing finding out that there was a certain level of dextrose in those Southern California or Middle California and Southern California IPA to make them dry and to make them drinkable and make the hops pop. And I'm like, well, I can do that, and let's just, instead of using dextrose, let's just use raw grain.
Yeah.
Raw rice. And it worked really well.
Right on. I think that's a great place to leave it. Kevin, thank you so much for going the distance. Before we let you go, where can listeners, where can drinkers find you working now? You're at Heater Allen Cold Dot. What are you doing there? What's the project? You still brewing cold IPAs?
We are, yeah. So Heater Allen was started 17 years ago by Rick Allen, and his daughter Lisa has been brewing here for 15 of those 17 years. And me and her got together while I was working at Wayfinder, and I moved down to McMinnville to be with her during the pandemic. And as much as I loved the project of Wayfinder, I wanted to have more control, and Rick wanted to retire. He's not retired, but he wanted to work a little bit less. And so he said, we all talked about it. And so me and Lisa bought majority stake in Heater Allen, and we wanted to launch our own brand of beers that, because Heater Allen is a heritage lager style brewery in the Northwest. It's never made IPAs, never done, really zany, wacky beers. And I wanted to do some stuff like that. I want to make some British ales. I want to make I want to go somewhere that Heater Allen hasn't been. And I thought it would be, it wouldn't make sense for the brand for Heater Allen to come out with IPA.
Yeah.
So we launched a brewery brand called Gold Dot. And, oh, that's interesting. I got cans right here that you can see.
Whoa.
Aren't they pretty?
It looks really slick, man. The branding looks very cool.
The branding's nice. It's kind of like a throwback to 60s Mad Men branding. It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
We really spent it. It's hard to do really simple branding. So, that's been a challenge. And, but we're making Helles, we're making Export, we're making a Dunkel, a dark lager. And then we're also doing a cold IPA called Staggers and Shacks. And it's just, we're a brewery-owned brewery, and we're trying to make a go of it.
Right on, man. Well, best of luck with it. And thank you again, Kevin Davey, for joining us here on Taplines. Listeners, if you could be here and share a cold IPA with me or share a cold IPA with Kevin, I'm sure you would enjoy it. But for now, we've got to go. Take care, Kevin. We'll catch you next time.
All right. Thanks, Dave. Appreciate it.
Taplines is recorded in Richmond, Virginia, and produced by yours truly and Darby Seaside, who, along with the talented Shane Farrick, composed our delightful soundtrack. Just listen to it. I also want to give a quick shout out to the entire VinePair team, and especially co-founders Adam Teeter and Josh Mallon, editor-in-chief Joanna Sherino, managing editor Tim McCurdy, and art director Danielle Grinberg, who designed our lovely Taplines logo. And of course, a big thank you to you, yes, you listener, for spending time with us week in and week out. We literally couldn't do this without you. I'm Dave Infante, and I'll catch you next time.